Hey, glad you're here. Welcome into our conversations on ships, as in relationships. We've been talking about how to have amazing relationships with those we live next to, work with, friend, fall in love with, live with. And we're talking about building blocks that make these amazing relationships. So we've talked about love. We've talked about honor. We've talked about forgiveness. Today, we're going to talk about serving. Serving those we're in relationships with. Let me tell you a story. Last week, Amy, my wife, and I left our house. We were driving out of our neighborhood, got onto the main street, and as we got onto the main street, we saw something very interesting. There were two sets of people on each side of the street. On the left side of the street, there was a group of people, and they were standing in front of a business, and they were protesting a decision that business has made. And they had signs out, and they had smiles on their faces, and the signs weren't anything derogatory, like with bad language or bad pictures or anything like that, but they were just signs. They were obviously protesting a decision the business has made. On the other side of the street was a young man with a pop-up tent and a cooler and a sign out front of the cooler that said, "Free back-to-school haircuts." And he just had a chair set under the tent. There was a couple of people waiting in line, one guy in the chair, and he was giving haircuts for back to school, apparently free haircuts. Here's my question. Which side of the street was serving? Which side of the street would Jesus say, that's what I meant when I said I didn't come to be served, but to serve? Let me take you there. Go to John chapter 13. Let me tell you a little bit what's happening in John chapter 13. Jesus and his disciples are sharing the Last Supper, the last meal he would have with them in a borrowed room before Jesus would be put on trial, would be crucified, and then ultimately raised from the dead. And it was also the time when he would institute the sacrament of Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, Eucharist. And in that moment, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Let me just read a little bit of the story to you. This comes from John chapter 13, verses 4 through 5. I'm going to do something a little different. I normally preach or teach out of the English Standard Version, but I'm going to use the Message paraphrase this week. It says, Jesus knew that the Father had put him in complete charge of everything, that he came from God and was on his way back to God. So he got up from the supper table, set aside his robe, and put on an apron. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with his apron. You see, here's what would go down in first century culture. People would bathe in public baths, okay? And when they would go out, especially if they were going to a big event or a celebration or whatever it was, they would certainly use a public bath to bathe. But then when they would get to the event or to the house or wherever they were going, their feet would have gotten dirty between their bath and the event they were going to. So they didn't need to bathe all over. They just needed to have their feet washed. Why? Because they walked everywhere. They wore sandals. They walked on dusty roads, the same dusty roads that they pushed their sheep and cattle down. And you know what sheep and cattle leave behind, right? And also these, just, there was no bathrooms. So when you needed to go to the bathroom, you just kind of went to the bathroom, right? And so all this is on the roads that they would walk down. So what I'm trying to get you to understand is their feet would be nasty by the time they got to the place where they were going. And they didn't sit around tables with chairs like you and I do today. In first century culture, they reclined at a table on the floor. So you would kind of side lie or lay on your side, on your elbow, and that means your feet would stick out next to the food on the table on the floor. The feet that had just walked down dusty roads with sheep poop and where people had gone to the bathroom. That's what you want at your kitchen table, right? And so it was a custom when people would come into the room, usually a designated servant, the lowest servant in the household, would wash the guest's feet, or the guest would be responsible for washing their own feet. But that didn't happen in the upper room with Jesus and his disciples. Why? Because there was no servant in the upper room. It was a borrowed room. There was no servant to do that. And apparently, none of the disciples took it upon themselves to wash their own feet or even Jesus' feet. Now, here's why I use the Message version, because it just uses words that pop out at us, because I want to look at several things here. Number one, we gather in the story that Jesus was the most powerful person in the room. Duh, he was Jesus. He was the master rabbi. In this culture, it's interesting. You need to understand that Jesus was no doubt the most powerful person in the room. Scripture says he knew that the Father had put him in complete charge of everything, that he came from God and was on his way back to God. If there was anyone who was absolutely not responsible for washing feet, it was Jesus, the most powerful person in the room. But here's what the most powerful person in the room did. He did three things. Watch this. Number one, Eugene Peterson in the Message translation tells us he got up. He got up from the supper table. Don't miss that he got up, because serving is an intentional decision. Serving doesn't just happen by accident. You don't just stumble into serving. You have to make a conscious decision to serve in your marriage, in your friendships, in your church, at your workplace, in your neighborhood. You have to make a very deliberate, intentional decision to serve. I remember this story about my wife, Amy. One time she was serving on a retreat of sorts, and she was serving kind of behind the scenes. So like helping with food and cooking and all those kind of things. And when they arrived at the retreat center, her and a couple of others were carrying in heavy loads of things to take to the kitchen and to unload and to get ready to use for the weekend retreat. And the band that was going to be leading worship at the retreat that weekend was already there, and they were kind of just sitting around some couches and some chairs as Amy and the other people that were serving behind the scenes were carrying everything in. And she tells the story that not one of those band members got up to help carry anything in that was going to be happening behind the scenes. That's a funny story, but the point of the story is this. If a band member can't pick up a box, they have no business picking up a drumstick, because serving is an intentional decision. We must make an intentional decision to serve. We have to get up from the supper table. And once we get up, we have to do the next thing Jesus did. He set aside his robe. Other translations say he took out his outer garments. But basically what he did is he took off what would be on the outside. And you and I, if we want to follow Jesus' example, have to take off our outer garments. Not necessarily take off our coat or our shirt or whatever it may be. Here's what it means. Jesus was the most powerful person in the room, but he took off that power and leveraged his position for the good of everyone in the room. So that's what serving is all about. In humility, we take off whatever status we have, whatever position we have, whatever power we have, whatever influence we have, and leverage those things for the good of those we're called to serve, for the good of those in the room, for the good of those in our marriage, in our household, in our family, in our workplaces, in our church, in the world. We take off those status symbols. We take off our pride. We take off the desire to be right. We take off the desire to say, I'm going to win. We take off all of those things. Listen, Jesus took off his robe, leveraged everything for the good of those in the room, knowing that the 24 feet he would wash would be nowhere near him the next day when he hung on a cross. Also knowing that 2 of the feet he washed would be the 2 that would run out of the room quickly to betray him and send those to arrest him in the garden. We must follow Jesus' example and serve others where they are, not where we expect them to be. We must serve them in the place where we're going to get no attention. It may not be well received. We may even feel like it's making no difference. Take off our robe and serve. There's a set of commandments. They're called the paradoxical commandments. They were originally written by Kent Keith in 1968. They became part of a booklet for student leaders. It's rumored that Mother Teresa adopted these and had them hanging in her room. Let me just read them to you anyway, because it describes so well what it means to take off your robe. People are illogical, unreasonable, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. If you are successful, you win false friends and true enemies. Succeed anyway. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness may make you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. The biggest men and women with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest men and women with the smallest minds. Think big anyway. People favor underdogs but follow only top dogs. Fight for a few underdogs anyway. What you spend years building may be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. People really need help but may attack you if you do help them. Help people anyway. Give the world the best you have and you'll get kicked in the teeth. Give the world the best you have anyway. That's what it means to take off your robe, to leverage everything you have for the good of those around you. So Jesus got up. He made an intentional decision to serve. He took off what he needed to take off so that he could serve to his fullest capacity. And the third thing that we're told in Eugene Peterson's translation is that he put on an apron. Now, some translations will say he wrapped a towel around his waist. I just love this visual of him putting on an apron. Because what does an apron indicate? One who's serving, one who's cooking, one who's doing all the work so that everyone else can enjoy all the goodness. To put on our apron. Listen, any one of the disciples in the room could have and should have washed everyone else's feet. But do you know what they were doing instead? Luke gives us this clue in Luke chapter 22 when he tells the story about what happened in the upper room. He tells us that they were arguing about who was the greatest and who was going to get to sit at the seat of honor next to Jesus. John and Matthew help us see that perhaps that seat was given to Judas. And while they were arguing about who was the greatest and who was the best among them, Jesus got up, took off his robe, put on an apron, became the lowest among them, and served them. Jesus tells us in several different places. Mark chapter 10, verse 45, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Mark chapter 9, verse 35, if anyone must be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Matthew chapter 20, verse 26, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Let me finish reading part of it from John chapter 13. This is verses 12 through 16, still in the Message translation. It says, then Jesus said, do you understand what I have done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. So what's Jesus saying? Yeah, I'm the most powerful person in this room. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I have laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do. I'm only pointing out the obvious. So let me ask you a question. Which side of the street are you standing on? The side holding the sign, protesting, or the side serving by giving out free haircuts? Jesus said, follow my example. So let's go. Let's follow his example. Let's serve those around us and create amazing relationships.